Hey everyone, welcome to this evening's live stream. I got an email yesterday that had a really good question in it, and that was, is it okay to have goats and chickens living together in the same barn? And I figured that considering the time of year, this is when everybody starts thinking about adding animals to their homestead, and that this is probably the first of many times I am going to get that question within the next couple months, because a lot of people right now are buying chicks and they're buying goats and all the animals. So the short answer is I wouldn't do it. So there's a lot of reasons why it is not a good idea to have chickens and goats living together in the same building. If they happen to come across each other's path in the pasture, not a big deal. But you don't want to have them in the same building together. The first thing, the biggest, most important thing for everybody to know is that chickens need grain. If you do not feed chickens a layer feed, they're not going to lay very much. You know, when we were new to chickens, we had somebody tell us like, oh, you don't need to feed them layer feed. You can just feed them cracked corn in the summer. They get all the protein they need from the bugs. Yeah, well, I'm glad that we started out feeding them layer feed, because when we switched to the corn, it was super obvious that that was not what they needed, because their egg production plummeted. So corn is very low in protein, like 6 to 8%. Eggs are protein, and you'd have to have some really seriously hustling chickens out there to get enough protein from catching bugs in the pasture. They can survive, yeah. But do you want your chickens to just survive, or do you want them to lay lots of eggs for you? So if you want them to lay lots of eggs for you, you need to feed them a layer feed, and they need to have that available all the time. And the problem with that is that layer feed is primarily grain, and goats love grain. It's like, me and chocolate, right? Except I'm smart enough. Like, I understand I can't eat all the chocolate I want to eat. Goats are not smart enough to understand that they cannot eat all the grain they want to eat. And goats can literally kill themselves. They can and will eat so much grain. And it's not just one thing. It's not like, oh, it's going to give them an upset tummy. Goats have a rumen, and really, ruminants should not have grain at all. They should have a forage-based diet. However, do not take that out of context of this video, because we have raised dairy goats today to produce more milk than what they can produce by feeding them a forage-based diet. So you may hear some researchers and vets and scientists refer to grain as concentrates, and that's because it is concentrated energy. You can get more protein and energy into a goat with grain volume-wise than you can with forage. So that is why dairy goats today, if you don't feed them grain, they will either not produce much milk at all. In fact, maybe not even enough to feed their kids. I just was helping a private consulting client with this a week ago. She was not feeding her goat enough goat feed, and the goat was not producing enough milk to feed her babies. And so this goat had gone from like producing 6 pounds a day at her previous farm to, I think it was like 1.5 pounds a day, because they didn't know that they were supposed to be feeding, how much they were supposed to be feeding her. So grain is incredibly important to goats, and they love it. So it's no problem getting them to eat it. However, the problem is, if they have access to chicken feed, which is primarily grain, they will just eat and eat and eat and eat until they upset their rumen, and it can cause many things. Best case scenario is that you'll just wind up with diarrhea. Worst case scenario, they can wind up with goat polio, which can kill them. They can wind up with enterotoxemia, which can kill them. They can end up with bloat, which can kill them. So you don't want to let your goats live anywhere that they would be able to get access to your chicken grain. And once they know where the chicken grain is located, it can be very hard to keep them away from it. We did actually initially, because we were clueless city slickers back in 2002, we thought we could use our barn for all the animals. And we did have the chickens in a separate stall from the goats. And the goats discovered where we kept the chicken grain. And the goats, you may have heard, goats are amazing escape artists. They are like the most brilliant animals on four legs. And we had goats get into the chicken grain more times than I can even remember. And luckily, the worst thing that ever happened was diarrhea. And I feel really certain that that's because we always had free choice baking soda available for them. So whenever they upset their tummy by eating too much grain, they were always able to self-medicate before we even knew what had happened. And so they would consume baking soda, and it would keep them from winding up with bloat or enterotoxemia or any of these other horrible things that could have killed them. And the diarrhea was self-limiting, and and it would go away within about 24 hours. So 12 hours a lot of times. So not a long-term serious problem. But that is the biggest reason that you do not want to have goats and chickens living together. Once we moved the chickens out of the barn, we built them their own chicken house. We would sometimes so the chicken house was originally built on the edge of our pond, and we would let the goats go out there to graze around the pond as part of their rotation. We do rotational grazing. I have lots of information on that. We do rotational grazing with the goats, and so they are always in different pastures. And when they would graze around the pond, we came up with a number of different things to try to keep them from going into the chicken house and eating the chicken grain. And what ultimately wound up happening is that we had a hanging chicken feeder, and we put it on a pulley, and we would only let the goats out there for about 6 hours a day. And during that 6 hours, we would use the pulley to pull the chicken feeder up high enough so that the goats could not get into it. And remember, this is rotational grazing. So that was only temporary. That was like only for a week or two that the chickens had limited access to their grain. And so it was kind of like we'd let the goats into the pond area, like from 10 to 4, something like that. So that they could eat a lot of the grass and the baby trees and stuff around the pond. And the chickens could get their grain. They had access to the grain 18 hours a day. So that worked well. The other thing is that we have had a few chickens through the years that have decided to move into the barn with the goats. And so there's a couple of problems with that also. So in that case, you don't have to worry about the goats eating the chicken grain, because the chicken is just taken upon itself to go in there. And there's a few issues there. One is, if the chickens decide to roost above your goats, the chickens are pooping on your goats. And that's gross, especially if you have milk goats. You don't want to have a goat coming into the milking parlor with chicken poop on its back, or worse, on its udder, because it laid down in chicken poop that was in, the chicken just pooped there, and then the goat comes along and lays down. So that's gross. The other thing that was interesting is that we had a couple chickens at various times through the last almost 22 years that decided they wanted to have a nest in the corner of the goat stall. And that gets tricky too, in terms of the eggs and the goats like stepping on an egg and breaking it or something like that when the chicken is not on the nest. So really, it's just not a good idea to let chickens and goats live together. You definitely don't ever want to have any way that your goats can get into the chicken grain, because that can cause such incredibly serious, sometimes fatal problems with your goats. And you really don't want to have your goats hanging out with, you don't really want to have your chickens hanging out with your goats, just because, chickens poop everywhere, and their poop is wet and messy. And so it can be really gross. Also, and then if they roost above your hay feeders, then they're pooping on the hay. And although there's not, most diseases are species specific, so there's not really, I can't think of any specific chicken diseases that they could give your goats. However, there is always the possibility that you have these nasty things like salmonella, E. coli, and stuff like that that can be in the poop of any healthy animal or human. And, so I always get very nervous when any animal is pooping on my goat's hay. Even if it's not a goat, if it's a goat, you have to worry about, parasites and stuff. But if it's another animal, it could be salmonella or something, and goats can get salmonella and get very sick. So can people. So, some of these things can make anybody sick. So anyway, I hope this has been helpful. If you are planning to add chickens to your homestead or goats to your chicken homestead, post in the comment section below and tell us what breeds you're thinking about getting. This is always such an exciting time of year for me. We're going to be getting some turkeys. We used to raise heritage turkeys for a long time, 17, 18 years. And then we didn't for a few years. We were just getting broad-breasted and butchering them in the fall. But we want to go back to raising our own heritage turkeys again. So we're really excited about that. My favorites have always been either the bourbon reds or the blue slates. Honestly, the blue slates have usually been my favorite. I think we've raised every heritage breed out there. I'm kind of leaning towards the bourbon reds this year. So anyway, if you guys are thinking of getting new birds or new goats this year, let us hear about it. And if you've got any questions, post in the comment section below and I'll get back to you. Take care. Bye for now.